Scott Ungermann, Brewmaster at Anchor Brewing Company, joins me this week to discuss craft beer. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 204. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 204, and it's early December 2019. Scott Ungermann joins me from Anchor Brewing to talk about Anchor Steam, craft beer, and more. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for home brewers and beer lovers. They're currently offering 20% off their all-access subscription pass with access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com/beersmith to get your all-access pass today. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com/beersmith. And also the Brew Easy. Brew big in small spaces with the best all-grain, ultra-compact system available. The Brew Easy's revolutionary setup combines batch sparge efficiency, brew-in-a-bag simplicity, and the wort clarification of a rim system. It's easy to set up, easy to operate, and easy on the eyes. Add the optional Brew Commander for precise temperature control and mash automation. With the Brew Easy, you'll discover definitive proof that size isn't everything. Electric and propane models are available. It's also the system I brew on. Visit blickmanengineering.com for more information. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And I recently converted the BeerSmith Recipes website to support mobile devices and also added the majority of the BeerSmith brewing tools to the site. Subscribers to BeerSmith 3 can access over 17 brewing tools online from any device, and anyone can select from thousands of recipes on the site. In fact, there's over 1 million recipes on the BeerSmith Recipes site now. Visit beersmithrecipes.com for your phone or computer to learn more. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Scott Ungermann, Brewmaster at Anchor Brewing Company. Scott was an English major at Berkeley before enrolling in the brewing program at UC Davis. He spent 18 years as a supervisor with AnheuserBusch before joining Anchor in 2014. Scott, it's great to have you on the show, man.
Well, thank you.
So how are you doing out there? How are things in San Francisco?
It's nice. It's been a rainy holiday weekend, but we can't complain about the rain. I always tell people you can't make beer without rain. So
that is true. Nice. That is true. Well, it's great to welcome you to the show. This is your first time coming on. I've been a big fan of Anchor going all the way back to the mid 80s, at least when I was in college. And I think you actually had your first round of Anchor roughly around that same time, right?
Yeah, I also went to college in the mid 80s out here on the West Coast in Berkeley, right across the bay from San Francisco, and had my first Anchors around about that time. Anchor Steam and Christmas ale was always a tradition. My dad would buy it every year, so I started collecting those bottles when I was a kid. But this was actually the first brewery I ever toured, so it really opened my eyes to the possibilities of what it's like to be in a brewery.
And now 30-something years later, you're the brewmaster.
Yeah.
Very cool. So I think you said you started homebrewing as well, probably about the same time I did, I think.
Yeah, so we toured this brewery. I toured with a bunch of buddies in 1987, and it was when I came here that I first learned about homebrewing. Hadn't ever even considered the possibility of making our own beer until our tour guide here told us about that he started as a home brewer, and we were like, wait, home brewing, what's that? And so when we figured out we could make our own beer at home, and figured out that there was a shop right in Berkeley called the Oak Barrel, it was only a couple weeks later that we were in the Oak Barrel buying our first homebrew kit and all the necessities.
I think I bought mine, the first one, in February of 1987 is when I started. So things were a little different back then, though.
Yeah, ours would have been a little later that same year, but a lot different. And it was, to me, it opened my eyes to possibilities that I didn't even know existed.
So at the time you were an English major attending the University of California at Berkeley, and then I understand you got interested in transitioning over to Davis. Did you finish at Berkeley first, or?
Yeah, I finished at Berkeley and went and got a job teaching high school down in Southern California. And it was while I was down there that my mom sent me an article on the brewing program at UC Davis, and that's when the light bulb went off that I could study brewing professionally and make a career out of it.
And of course, you didn't join Anchor until quite a bit later. So I think you worked for AnheuserBusch for many years, right?
Yeah, so when I finished my master's at Davis, the plan was for me was to go get a job in the brewing industry, learn the ropes, and then eventually start my own brewery. And that hope was to do that on the West Coast. But when I graduated, my wife had a job offer on the East Coast, so we moved out to New Jersey, kind of sight unseen, and showed up in New Jersey in the mid '90s. And there wasn't a real active craft brewing scene in New Jersey in 1995. So my two interviews out there were with Stroh Brewing Company in Pennsylvania and Anheuser-Busch in Newark, New Jersey. And Anheuser-Busch is where I got the job, and that's where it all started as far as professional brewing for me.
And then I understand you served a couple different positions with Anheuser, and then eventually, let's see, it was 2014. I think you went to Anchor, right?
Yeah, so I spent 18 years with AB, first in Newark, New Jersey for 7 years, 2 years in Columbus, Ohio, 2 years in St. Louis, Missouri at the mothership, and then they moved me back out west to Fairfield, where I eventually became the brewmaster. And so after 18 years, I was ready to get off that train and come back to what my true roots really were, which is when the job came open at Anchor. I was immediately intrigued and applied and got the gig in a rapid succession, and kind of left my job without even taking a day off in between leaving AB and coming here.
Wow. Well, I still want to dive into some of your experiences as head brewer. Before that, though, I was hoping we could get into some of the rich history behind Anchor Brewing Company, which dates all the way back to, I think, 1896 and the California Gold Rush, right?
That is correct. Yeah, and even further back than 1896, really, 1871, a man named Gottlieb Breckels founded the Golden City Brewery out here in San Francisco, making steam beer, which is a style of beer that's really indigenous to San Francisco and the West Coast style of brewing, with German immigrants coming over with German lager yeast and finding very different environment in which to make their beer, and made these warm fermented lagers and open fermenters and open cool ships for cooling up on the roofs of the breweries, and hence the nickname Steam. And so the Golden City Brewery was sold in 1896 to two other German immigrants, Mr. Ernst Baruth and Otto Schinkel, and they changed the name to Anchor Brewing in 1896. So that's really the genesis of Anchor Brewing here in San Francisco.
And of course, Anchor was one of the few small breweries to restart after Prohibition and survive to its current day, basically. It was also one of the first ones to achieve nationwide brand recognition. I know I recognized it as a craft brewery even back in the 80s.
Yeah, and before the term craft brewing even existed, we were a little microbrewery out here in San Francisco, and Fritz Maytag bought the brewery in 1965 when it was really on death's door, about to be closed. The last brewery making a style of beer called steam beer out here on the West Coast, and really when Fritz bought this brewery in 1965 when it was about to close, that would have been the end of steam beer as we know it. So not only did Fritz save the brewery, he saved a style of beer from extinction. And then as he grew the business and grew the brand here, first in San Francisco and then California wide, he also expanded his repertoire and began making other styles of beer that people were unfamiliar with in the West Coast and in America as a whole, making Anchor Porter and Liberty Ale and Christmas Ale eventually in 75. And those innovations, those were, really what sparked the craft brewing revolution in America.
And you're sitting in Fritz's office right now, aren't you?
Yeah. Yep. We call it the library today. You can see behind me the collection of books that Fritz left here when he sold the brewery back in 2010. It's really pretty much untouched since he left. All we did was moved the desk out and put a table in here for tastings, and the rest has been preserved.
Well, I also wanted to discuss the origins of Anchor Steam Beer, which is now called the California Common Beer Style. I think Steam Beer is a trademark of Anchor, right?
Yep.
So can you go through a little bit of the origins of that particular beer style and what makes it unique? Because it is a very unique style.
Yeah, it's the definition that we give to steam beer is that it is a lager that is fermented warm in an open fermenter, and so those characteristics make it unique. The style of beer originated, as I said, here in San Francisco when German immigrants came at about the time of the gold rush. When other people were looking for gold, these guys were looking to make liquid gold, and they brought their recipes and their yeast, and they used local barley and local hops that could be grown here. But the one thing they didn't have, refrigeration, because it hadn't been invented yet. And also they didn't have ice. They didn't have caves. So as far as how to cool, they resorted to kind of more primitive methods with open cool ships up on the roof. Found a very cool climate here in San Francisco, that ideal for cooling to a nice 60-degree temperature, which is the temperature that we still use today in our fermentation rooms. But those cool ships have gone the way of kind of the past. But the open fermentation is something that Fritz Maytag was very felt that was the embodiment of steam beer, and he has preserved that in the new brewery that he built, which was new back then in the 70s, but where we've been operating since 1979, is a brewery that's specifically built to have these open pan fermenters in a room that's chilled year round to 60 degrees, and that's the only cooling is the cool air in the room.
That's very cool. Do you still use open fermentation for other styles of beer as well, or just the Anchor Steam?
We actually, we make a few different, we have two different rooms with open fermenters that have different geographies. So the room where we make steam beer is also where we make California lager. So that is an open fermented lager, and technically a steam beer itself, although it's fermented a little cooler than steam. And then we have another room where the ales are, where the ale yeast is kept separately. Those also are open fermenters, but they're deeper. And they have cooling jackets on them so that we can control those fermentation temperatures a little more actively. And in that room, we make Liberty Ale and Anchor Porter and all of our Christmas Ale.
And of course, Anchor, one of the defining features of Anchor too is the hops used, right? The steam beer.
Yeah, for steam beer, absolutely. Northern Brewer hops have been in steam beer since the beginning.
Any other tips for making steam beer? I just thought I'd close that topic out.
Yeah, if you're trying to make it as a home brewer, it's really hard to replicate open fermentation unless you build yourself something specifically for that. And keeping that clean is definitely a challenge. But we come in warm and we allow it to free rise. We then do a secondary maturation that's also not super cold. The cellar is kept about 58 degrees. So that secondary fermentation that for us is about 2 weeks. Of course, we kreuzen. That's something that's very difficult to do from a home brewing perspective. But we kreuzen in a closed tank for that secondary maturation. Wow.
So you're kreuzening not for bottling, but actually for maturation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So, so I want to make this at home. What kind of a grain bill would I use?
90% pale two-row, 10% caramel malt. We use a C40.
40. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It gives it kind of an light amber cover.
Yeah.
Color.
It's we like to call it copper colored, but yeah, copper amber.
We used to have amber beers. Remember those?
Yeah, well, steam beer still got that beautiful copper color.
Well, moving forward to the early craft beer years, Anchor was one of the first to brew a lot of the English styles, porters, barley wines, and English India Pale Ale, right?
Yeah, the porter was actually Fritz's first true innovation after he bought the brewery in 1965. He really spent 7 years perfecting steam beer and nothing else. And so it wasn't until 1972 that he began working on Anchor Porter. And if you think about how Fritz was definitely already not making a mainstream beer, and how American beers went in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with the big breweries getting bigger and the small breweries dropping by the wayside, and everybody essentially making light golden lagers. Fritz had a beer that was already fairly caramel colored and a bit of an odd duck in the 1970s beer market in America. And then when he made his first innovation, he went even farther afield and made a dark beer, made a porter that was really the first truly American porter. And he used, American malts and American hops and an English ale yeast to make a dark, robust, flavorful porter that was mind-blowing in the early 70s. And then his next innovations came in 75 with both Liberty Ale and Christmas Ale. And Liberty Ale, like you said, really the first dry-hopped American Pale Ale, really the forefather of all IPAs in America, is Liberty Ale.
And you mentioned using American hops with all those as well, right? What style of hops did you use?
Liberty Ale's Cascade hops.
Cascade, of course, one of the classics, perhaps.
Yeah.
For American. And what about the porter?
Porter also uses Northern Brewer like steam beer.
Nice. And I think Anchor also produced a pretty unique beer in 1989 called Ninkasi.
Oh, Ninkasi. Yeah, actually.
Made from bread, I think.
Yeah, actually, it's made from the recipe that is the hymn of Ninkasi. So Fritz was a history major and always very interested in the history of brewing. And when he discovered that essentially the first written document anywhere in the world, the hymn of Ninkasi, was a recipe for making beer, he had to have a go at it. And yeah, I'd have to do a little more research to remember exactly what it was, but it's like an unleavened bread in the mash, and then add honey and some figs, I believe, in the fermentation, and the yeast from the figs is what kicks off the starter. So really interesting project.
Very cool. Well, if we fast forward to today, the industry has changed substantially, and I know you've been instrumental in creating a number of new beers for Anchor. What are some of your recent lineups, and how do they compare maybe to what you were doing back in the 80s?
We do continue to innovate, as everybody does. That's kind of the world we live in today is definitely having something new as often as every week. We have a pilot brewery in Taproom across the street here from the brewery, where we are literally releasing something new every week. And it's where we're working on bigger releases, but we're also making little 7-barrel batches of things that are just pure fun. And so it runs the gamut from some kettle sours with fruit in them to many different IPAs. Obviously, IPAs are still king in craft beer today, and so some of our more recent releases have also been IPAs, a collaboration that we did with a local organization that's involved with keeping the San Francisco Bay clean, Beekeeper. We made a Beekeeper IPA to really celebrate what those folks do. We made a San Francisco IPA that has some peach and apricot in it, and is a little bit hazy and juicy and absolutely delicious. They keep coming.
Well, maybe could you go in depth with a couple of them? Let's talk about Beekeeper first, I guess, since you just mentioned it.
Yeah, sure. Beekeeper is an IPA that uses a blend of hops that are added in what we have is a flow-through dry hop vessel, where we are recirculating the dry hopping through. We also are adding hops in the hot wort tank. running, easily 5 times the amount of hops that we put in a Liberty Ale. We're putting into this particular IPA.
I assume a lot of that's Whirlpool and dry hop, right?
Yeah, most of it Whirlpool and dry hop. It's actually only, like around 50 IBUs. I don't remember the exact target, but yeah, it's not an exceedingly bitter beer. It's all about the aromatics. And the hops that we're using in there, using some Cascade. It's a nice base hop that we like to add in on dry hopping. We're also using Calypso Eldorado. And I believe it's Simcoe Cryo that's in there as that last hop.
The cryo hops, yeah, which are lupulin powder, I think, right?
Yeah.
Nice. So have you started using more blends in your hopping? As opposed to doing single varieties?
Yeah, we will do the blends ourselves. We don't necessarily, we bought a few commercial blends, but essentially, yes, we'll blend the varieties ourselves. One of the things we found, especially through pilot brewing, single hops are nice, and they express themselves well, but it's for a rounder bouquet of hops, nice to use a blend.
And I know a lot of brewers have gone to blends as well because it's easier to supply in some cases, right? You got some flexibility if you can't get a particular variety.
Especially, if you're making things over the long haul and crop year to crop year, you see some variability in availability too, like you said. So if you have a hard time getting Mosaic and you got to drop that down in the blend and substitute with something else, it's easier to do rather than basing a recipe just on one single hop. And if you can't get that hop, then you're making a different beer.
And another one I know you wanted to talk about was Fogbreaker's IPA. Kind of unique, right?
Yeah, the Fogbreaker is a really nice beer. Not as big as Beekeeper, and more of a West Coast IPA really than some of the newer IPAs that we've made.
What are some of the top selling beers you have right now? Which ones sell the most?
Anchor Steam Beer is by far our largest single brand. Actually, our second largest brand is our variety pack when you look at sales. So, and that rotates certain beers through it.
I'm sorry, what was the second one? I missed.
Variety pack.
The variety pack. That makes sense.
Yeah, the variety pack itself is our second largest selling SKU. But after that, we've got California Lager and Christmas Ale. Actually, although it's only sold for 2 months out of the year, is our third largest single brand.
And that leads into you wanted to talk about Anchor's 45th annual Christmas Ale this time, I think, right?
Yeah.
Can you give us some specifics about that brew?
Yeah. Christmas Ale, the really fun thing about making Christmas Ale every year is that it's different. It's new. And that's something that Fritz started a very long time ago. As you said, 45th annual at this point, but varying the recipe every year and changing up the tree that's on the label makes it this exciting new thing that comes once a year, and unwrapping it's like unwrapping a present. I can tell you that I collected these bottles as a kid. And so to me, when I came here to Anchor, it was probably the single most exciting part of starting this new job at this new brewery and being a part of Christmas Ale and seeing how it unfolds and seeing how early I started here in April of 2014, and they were already working on Christmas Ale when I got here. And that I got to be a part of that first year. I just really kind of sat back and watched, took it all in. And then by the second year, I began to, drive the recipe, and really, that's a huge responsibility to take something that's had all these years of creativity behind it, and to make sure that we're moving it forward and we're doing things that are making the beer better every year. That's the idea, is to always start with last year's recipe and how are we going to make it better this year? So what are we going to add in and what are we going to take out? How are we going to drive it to not only taste better today, but knowing that people taste these in verticals and put them down for a few years, how will it age more gracefully? And one of the things that we've done over the years is ratchet up the alcohol level a little bit. So Christmas Ale was at 5.5 ABV for years, and we took it up a notch, and then another notch, and then this year we're all the way up at 6.9, which is the same place we were last year. And that higher alcohol allows you to kind of carry more in the beer and allows it to age more gracefully. This year we're a little darker than where we were last year. Last year we took it back to kind of a light brown ale, which is reminiscent of the Christmas ales of the 80s. When I was coming up and first tasting those beautiful Christmas ales of 86 and 87. And we've taken the spice notes down a little bit over the years. We felt like the spice was overwhelming the beer a little bit. So very specific spices over the last couple of years. Really, this year aiming at what we call a coastal spice, and to get an idea of that, it's really that herbaceous note of, especially being out on the coast after it rains and smelling the wind as it blows through those cypress trees, and having that specific San Francisco flavor to it. And it's a light brown ale, like I said last year, and this year a little darker brown ale, but kind of in between those super dark beers of the last few years before 18, and then we've arrived at a really nice place with a mellow and smooth and silky Christmas ale that's also got a flavor punch to it, and really, really goes well with food. And I can tell you, after having it with my Thanksgiving meal and my Thanksgiving dessert, it was absolutely delicious.
So is this something you change a little bit every year, or is there
every year is a new recipe? Yeah. Every year the starting point is last year's recipe, and then we develop some prototypes here and taste them and figure out what we're going to take away and what we're going to add in new.
Oh yeah, what kind of spices are you using? Are you using traditional Christmas spices like nutmeg? I know you mentioned kind of a cypress twinge to it.
Yeah, it's a secret recipe. So if I told you, then it wouldn't be secret.
That's true. It wouldn't be secret anymore.
But we do, people love to guess, and we do occasionally tell people what's not in it. But there's, you could
tell me and 40,000 of my friends, couldn't you?
Essentially, we use spices that are readily attainable. We don't go out there and source things that you're not going to be able to find on your own. But it's when you're making a spice beer, the one thing I would say is you can be too heavy-handed, and you can add things that make your beer smell like potpourri or like you just walked into a Yankee Candle shop, and that is not our desire. So we're, it's subtle spices that elevate and accentuate the beer, and that's about as far as I can go with it.
That's cool. How does your lineup of beers today compare to what you had in 2014 when you started?
It evolves. I would say that, in 14, we were just releasing our first IPA, and we had a couple more things coming later that year. We had a Brewmaster series. We were working on kind of that series of beers that we tried a few times, and I think that at this point we've really backed off from that, and are focused on our core, focused on Anchor Steam, Liberty Ale, California Lager, having more than just a couple IPAs, is kind of too many for a brewery our size. So, 2 IPAs at a time seems to be the right number. Fogbreaker being the one that's year round, and then having the seasonal ones with Beekeeper and San Francisco seems to be the right balance for us. And of course, we still make the barley wine, and we still have barrel aged releases that are available here in San Francisco, and then something new every week at the public tap room across the street. But
you mentioned the pilot brewery. Can you access a lot of the innovative stuff you're doing there through the tap room?
Yep, that's where it's all local. And the two things that have remained hot in my 5 years here, new and local. And so, the one thing is you can only be new once, and you can only be local in one place. So we've really focused on that here in San Francisco, that having a lot of interesting and innovative things for the local market keeps people interested, keeps them coming.
So, of course, you have a tap room. You have tours, I believe, as well. Can you tell folks where they can find out more, or maybe even schedule a tour, where to go?
Yeah, you can, if you just go to our website online, anchorbrewing.com, there is a place there where you can register for tours. We are open 7 days a week for tours. In the midweek days, it's 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. On the weekends, we actually run 3 tours, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that are noon, 2, and 4. And those are obviously the most popular one. There is kind of a urban myth out there that it takes months in advance to get a tour here. It used to be that way. There were very few tours, and they were only during the week, and you could only do it over the phone, and you had to do it weeks in advance. These days, if you want to sign up for a Tuesday afternoon tour or midweek, they're always available. Weekend tours require a little bit of foresight, but not a whole bunch. You can book tours online pretty easily.
And so, since you're Brewmaster, or perhaps the oldest craft brewery in the U.S., where do you see craft beer brewing going in the future?
Well, it's an interesting time in the brewing industry right now. You continue to see, like I said, those two trends, new and local, continue to dominate. IPA continues to dominate. You continue to see new openings of little brew pubs and microbreweries all over the country. And so I think that continues to a point. I've heard the number thrown out there of 10,000 breweries. Will we get there in the next couple of years? It's possible. I'm scared by some of the trends that I see, the trends of not beer. I don't want to name it by name, but the sparkling water alcohol combo that is sweeping the nation is something that is not really brewing, and breweries are doing it though. And breweries are sustaining their livelihood by doing it. And if we train a whole generation of people that that's the way you drink beer, then we lose some of the art and some of the craft of what we do.
Interesting. Do you think there's going to be a shakeout? I know we're getting to quite a few breweries out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely signs of that. It's a very competitive marketplace. There's been, consolidations. There have been breweries bought by other breweries. There have been breweries bought by various other interests. And then there are some people that are trying to stay fiercely independent. And that's difficult. And it's difficult because of shelf space and tap handles being limited. And there, at some point, it does become very, very difficult. Other than just distributing in your own little marketplace. If I was opening a brewery today, it would be not a packaged brewery. It would be a brew pub in a town that didn't have one. And those towns still exist. There aren't that many, but they do still exist.
So, you like the taproom model, and I assume, well, of course, you distribute package as well. Nationwide,
oh yeah,
right?
I mean we're in 50 states and 20 different countries, and it's I think it would be difficult to open a brewery. I mean, always it's difficult to open anything, but to have the aspirations of opening a brewery that's going to be selling beer in 50 states and abroad, it's
pretty hard to do right off the bat, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think's beyond IPA? IPA's obviously dominated. I think it's more than half the craft beer produced in the U.S. now. What do you think's next after IPAs?
I think there's a desire for drinkability. I think, obviously what I mentioned about, the extremely drinkable seltzer booze combo is one trend. But I think in the middle, when you talk about beer, traditional beer, that golden ales and lagers and pilsners and light, crisp, drinkable beers will always have a market. There are always going to be people that just want to drink a beer without having to think too deeply, without having to know what hop varieties are in it, and just drinking for that pure pleasure of this tastes good and it's easy to drink and it's delicious and well made.
And of course, since you started as a home brewer some 30, I don't know, some odd years ago, what advice do you have for homebrewers that want to get better at the craft?
I think as a homebrewer, when I started to feel more comfortable, it was sticking to a couple of base styles and making beers that really had not a lot of complications. There was a time where I tried to get super fancy and make all kinds of really interesting things, and some of those were absolutely delicious, and some of them were complete failures. Once I realized that, for me, just making a straight up pale ale and trying to perfect the hops was more in line with what I wanted to be drinking. I think I got better at identifying kind of where the defects were and working on yeast management and making sure, how important that aspect is. Fermentation is always the most important aspect of flavor consistency in my mind. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with raw materials and ingredients in the brew house, but really, if you want a consistent beer, work on fermentation. Make sure you have consistent, good yeast, that you have a yeast strain that works well in the fermenter geometry that you have, at the temperatures that you're able to ferment at. And once you have that yeast strain that you trust, that works for your base beers, stick with it.
Yeah, certainly. I can vouch for that. I when I started brewing, I was definitely making too many styles of beer, and not particularly good at any of them until I focused on one. So, Scott, it's great to have you on the show. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you for coming on today.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Again, my guest today was Scott Ungermann. He's brewmaster at Anchor Brewing. Thank you, Scott.
All right. Thanks. Goodbye.
A big thank you to Scott Ungermann for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're currently offering 20% off their all-access subscription pass with access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com/BeerSmith to get your all-access pass today. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com/BeerSmith. And also the Brew Easy. Brew big in small spaces with the best all-grain, ultra-compact system available. The Brew Easy's revolutionary setup combines batch barge efficiency, brew-in-a-bag simplicity, and the wort clarification of a rim system. It's easy to set up, easy to operate, and easy on the eyes. Electric and propane models are available. It's also the system I personally brew on. Visit BlickmanEngineering.com for more information. Again, that's BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, I converted the BeerSmithRecipes.com website to support mobile devices and also added the majority of the tools to the site. Subscribers to BeerSmith 3 can access over 17 brewing tools online from any device, and anyone with an account can browse from tens of thousands of recipes. Visit BeerSmithRecipes.com from your phone or computer to learn more. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.